war when she went to the South Pacific, so contrasting to that excited face of war that you saw on those tours of production facilities where everything was being built. Here now she sees that, my God, what we're building, these ships and the tanks and the weapons, are being used to kill people and to kill our own people as well.
Eleanor came back from the Pacific determined to ensure that the sacrifices of American soldiers would result in the emergence of a more just society at war's end.
And if your heart is with any man, in some way it must be with all. All the men are our men, part of our United States, which they have saved, so that we can still call it the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Eleanor's successes were tangible. By 1943, FDR, at Eleanor's urging, had issued an executive order banning discrimination in the defense industries and mandated increased integration of the armed services. Small but significant steps on the road to racial justice. For his part, FDR began to look towards the America the troops would find when they came home. On July 28, 1943, he spoke of the kind of society he wanted to see emerge from the sacrifice of millions of ordinary Americans. He laid out the blueprint for what became the GI Bill of Rights.
We are today laying plans for the return to civilian life of our gallant men and women in the armed services. They must not be demobilized into an environment of inflation and unemployment, to a place on the breadline or on a corner selling apples. We must this time have plans ready.
But the war was not over. By the fall of '43, FDR would finally meet the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Churchill warned the president that the Bolsheviks weren't to be trusted. Roosevelt thought he knew better. He didn't. On the Soviet front, the tide had finally turned. Russian troops defeated the Nazis at Leningrad and Stalingrad. Hitler's troops were now in headlong retreat as Soviet divisions moved toward the Polish eastern border. The Soviets recognized that if they were the only ones marching on Berlin, Moscow would dictate the post-war map of Europe.
I believe Stalin was already calculating what the post-war world would look like, and that what had to come out of this war, the price that the Soviet Union paid was so heavy, was so dire, that he wanted them to dominate the continent.
The path to victory in the Pacific was also coming into focus. At the helm, Roosevelt had appointed four-star General Douglas MacArthur as his theater commander, a man he neither liked nor trusted. But MacArthur was respected among his fellow officers, and there was another crucial political consideration to be made.
He picked MacArthur for the Pacific for rather odd reasons to keep him occupied and out of his hair, MacArthur being so anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal, arch-conservative.
For over a year, MacArthur had protested the European First strategy. He warned that nothing short of an invasion of Japan would secure total victory, an invasion that might cost 1 million American lives. Roosevelt saw a partial solution. He would get the Soviets to end their policy of Asian neutrality and join the fight.
No one yet knew if the atomic bomb would work, if it would be available in time to be used either in Europe or in Japan, what its effect might be. There were huge question marks about that particular piece of technology. So there was a lot riding on the idea that it would be the Soviet entry that would finally crush Japan's ambitions in Asia.
On the afternoon of November 11th, 1943, Roosevelt stole away from the White House, crossing the Atlantic, for a top-secret conference in Tehran with Winston Churchill, and, for the first time, the person FDR most wanted to meet, Joseph Stalin.
He was hopeful that Stalin would come to understand that the United States was not an aggressive imperial power, that we had no long-term designs on destroying the Soviet system or Soviet government.
Before the first session, Roosevelt warned Churchill that he intended to poke fun at the British Prime Minister's bulldog determination.
Really, what he was trying to do was to ingratiate himself with Stalin at Churchill's expense.
Despite the advanced warning, the ridicule proved difficult to accept for the notoriously insecure prime minister.
I think he was humiliated by it. I think he was angry but stoical. Again, it was this question which was always in Churchill's mind. Have I established a real intimacy with Roosevelt? Am I going to be able to be absolutely honest with him?
Whether Roosevelt felt the strategy worked remains unclear. However, Tehran did produce tangible, if controversial, agreements.
He signaled to Stalin at Tehran very, very clearly, I think unambiguously, that the United States would give the Soviet Union a fairly free hand in the areas of Eastern Europe that the Red Army liberated in the course of the fighting in World War II. Stalin, it seems to me, quite understandably came away from that meeting thinking that he had the approval of Franklin Roosevelt for being the dominant power in Eastern Europe at the war's conclusion.
A tacit understanding given, in part, to win Soviet agreement to take on Japan after the fall of Germany. FDR returned to Washington claiming he had secured a breakthrough at Tehran, that he'd established a close personal relationship with the Soviet leader. He gave an upbeat assessment for the weekly newsreels.
I may say that I got along fine with Marshal Stalin. He is a man who combines a tremendous, relentless determination with a stalwart good humor. And I believe that we are going to get along very well with him and the Russian people. Very well indeed.
Privately, Roosevelt later told Eleanor that the greatest challenge he faced was to win Stalin's trust.
My husband said, Stalin has no faith in us at all. So I think the only thing we can do, since we must stay together as allies and trust each other as allies, is to see to it that from now on, whatever we promise, we keep our word. And not only we keep our word, but we see to it that the British keep their word.
As 1944 began, Roosevelt was about to face the rigors of yet another presidential campaign. By now, his body was wearing down. His energy and drive were waning. His closest friends feared he might not live to relish the fruits of a battle won. By January 1944, FDR had been president for 11 years. Yet after all this time, the president still found it necessary to remain secretive, to restrict information not just from his contemporaries, but also from history.
He left no written record behind. He didn't want note-taking done at cabinet meetings. If he'd had his way, all the records of his meetings with Stalin and Churchill and other heads of state would have been destroyed.
One private record was kept. It was written by his distant cousin, Daisy Suckley, who was his nearly constant companion during the last year of his life. Her diary, discovered in a suitcase under her bed 50 years after Roosevelt's death, provides a unique insight into what would be the final year of Roosevelt's life.
February 24th, 1944. The president is tired. He acknowledges it and wants to get out of his grueling job. But there is too much demand for him to stay in, not only from this country, but also from the United Nations. If one could only look into the future.
It is through Daisy's eyes that we learn about the rapidly declining health that for too long was obvious to Daisy and the president's daughter, Anna, who had come to live at the White House. They observed an inability to concentrate and his frequent complaint of severe headaches, symptoms that troubled the two women far more than they appeared to worry the president's own doctors.
March 2nd, 1944. The president felt feverish and generally miserable and lay on the sofa. Anna and I put pillows behind him. March 24th. President in bed again. He has a slight fever and he worries about it. But neither he nor the doctor seems to know how to get down to first principles.
Daisy was a very careful watcher of FDR, and she began to notice a sort of periodic weakening, wherein he seemed sort of ashen,
and he would lose track of what he was talking about sometimes. And